Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me today on Writers at Work is New York Times Enterprise reporter Christopher Maag. Recently, Chris wrote what I consider to be an extraordinary feature about a woman who, at age 17, survived a plane crash. I'll get back to that story in a minute. Chris is a veteran reporter, having written for national and local magazines, USA Today, The Record, and the Seattle Times. Before joining the New York Times staff, he freelanced for the paper for a decade, covering the Midwest. When you click on the links on his website or in the Times archive, you'll find that Chris has delved into the human side of some of the biggest stories of our lifetime, including the September 11th attacks and the impact of COVID. When he covers breaking news, he occasionally will reveal a sly sense of humor. In a recent piece about a man who filmed himself while breaking into the mayor's residence in New York, Chris disclosed that Mayor Adams believes the house is haunted. But some stories are absent humor, like his recent piece on the 4-month-old who died from a cocaine overdose. As for the tale of the airline crash survivor, you can find his feature in the Times archives or via Google. The headline hints at what's to follow. The plane crash should have killed her. Sometimes she wishes it had, adding, survival has been its own ordeal. Chris tells us that, traveling by herself, Astrid Lopez was on her way from Bogota, Colombia, to Disney World via New York. The trip a reward for her good grades. Hours after takeoff, Flight 52 crashed into a tree on Long Island. 73 passengers were killed. Chris included this bit of memorable color in his piece. Rescue workers found a toddler dangling from a tree, cold but uninjured. Astrid, now 52, has endured 70 surgeries. Let me now pause to greet Chris, a writer whose work, to my eyes, has both the propulsion and flow of great storytelling, regardless of medium. Christopher Maag, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you for having me.
Chris, how did you get your start in the newspaper business?
I've been doing this a while, and I've had a couple of starts. I started at a weekly newspaper on Mercer Island outside of Seattle in about 1998. And back then, I didn't think of it as writing. I thought of it primarily as somebody else is going to pay me to get a master's degree forever. And I found that I liked it. And then I quit because I hadn't traveled yet. So I went to Guatemala, I learned Spanish, and I'd been in and out of writing for 5 years when I stumbled on a book, a compilation by Tom Wolfe of his early magazine stories. And it just blew my mind. I realized, oh, you can do this with nonfiction? This is incredible. So it's been a long process of me realizing that one can actually write well and still write nonfiction.
So in addition to Wolfe, who were your early heroes and your models?
For a long time it was, and still remains, I still respect her and love her, Susan Orlean. I find that her brightness, her turns of phrase, her humor are just incredible. And it's kind of the New Yorker mafia. I mean, I love John McPhee, Ian Fraser, Joseph Mitchell. Also, obviously, we found some issues with fact that he was Joseph Mitchell. He's still a master craftsman. So when I'm in a pickle and can't figure out how to write something, I often go to I have a shelf on my bookshelf of the best, and pick books from that.
Oh, I'm a bit older than you. When I grew up, we had Murray Kempton and Jimmy Breslin and those kind of guys, and we were blessed to read good writing on a daily basis in newspapers. I think back then we were kind of spoiled by the quality of the writing.
Mm-hmm. I've had some interactions with readers. This has happened a few times, but the one I remember the best was At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I wrote, was trying to write in a narrative nonfiction way about the flood of dead bodies, just overwhelming cemeteries in New Jersey. And I got an angry email by a woman, a reader, who said, "How dare you write this way about people who've died?" And I wrote back and I said, I feel I have to apologize on behalf of my industry that you don't, I've never experienced newspaper writing that is also good.
Mm.
That your expectations are so low that this would offend you means that we are not doing a great job as an industry.
Yeah, yeah. When you were so once now you're gonna get serious about this newspapering stuff. Did you have an early preference? Did you like covering breaking news, or did you prefer feature writing?
I've only come to enjoy breaking news in the last year or so. I cover for the New York Times. I'm on the Metro desk here, and they have me every Thursday doing the late breaking shift, so noon to 8. And I did not like it at the beginning. It terrified me. I don't consider myself somebody who is great at breaking news. Now I've really come to enjoy it because even if it's not great writing, it's fun just to be on deadline pressure. And then if it's great writing on top of that, that's a happy accident. Um, I didn't, I never necessarily went out of my way to write for newspapers. I definitely had the dream, as I got more serious about this, I was reading Harper's Magazine in its prime, late 90s, early 2000s. And if I still kind of think this way that a combination of if I knew myself a little better, and if I had a way to pay my bills independent of writing, I would like to be one of those classic people who write books and then peels chapters off to be published in magazines. That
Mm.
that model, I think, has died because book publishing and the magazine industry are under such tremendous threat. Um, but that still would be the heart of my dream, but I lacked those things internally, and when I was getting started anyway, newspapers were still a place where one could get a job. I don't think they were under threat then, but it's becoming less and less true now. But this was a way that I could pay the bills.
And you remember an early assignment where um, you understood that writing it really well was going to be a way to hook the reader.
Definitely. And I actually remember the lead.
Uh,
My first job at a daily newspaper, the paper doesn't exist anymore. It was called the East Side Journal on the east side, in the east side suburbs of uh, Seattle. And I learned of this fundamentalist megachurch. I mean, this thing had 3,000 people showing up for a single service, but they didn't have a church. They were a church on wheels. And so they rented an industrial space. They kept all of their risers and their baptismal bath in trailers. And part of the church volunteer effort, major part of it, was to drive the physical parts of the church to a local high school that they rented out on Sundays, a giant high school, and turn this high school into a church with 2 full services, with full bands and baptisms and preaching. Very charismatic preacher, leader of the church. And my lead was, I don't remember the character's name, but the lead was, let's say, John Smith, was pulling the church altar behind, sorry, John Smith was pulling the church altar with his black Ford F-150 when the trailer hitch snapped.
Wonderful.
And I worked I didn't know how to write yet. So I worked probably 3 weeks to get that sentence. And once I had it, I realized, oh yeah, that
Yeah.
that's it just, I hadn't read anything. I hadn't read Tom Wolfe yet. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew that feeling of that works.
Well, that feeling is something I wanted to talk about. In my early days at the Wall Street Journal, somebody told me that the measure of a quality feature is when somebody reads it who had absolutely no interest in the subject. And
Mhm.
I find that when I'm writing something, and I'm not all that interested in it, it's my writing that will make me interested in it, because I'll find things that I want to serve up in a way that is interesting.
Mhm.
And I think that feeling that you just talked about, um, it really tells you if you should be doing what you're doing,
Yeah,
because that sort of internal excitement is transmitted.
absolutely. I mean, I'm lucky in two regards on what you just said. One is I can get curious about anything. I don't get book curious about anything. I have yet to find in 20 odd years of doing this a subject where I wanted to spend the years required to turn it into a book. I've had lots of book ideas, and some of them were really good, but I get bored.
You
Uh,
do.
but I can get interested in absolutely anything for 6 weeks.
Right.
So that helps. And the other thing in terms of writing, when it's more on that subject of vibe. Not every story is this. Not every I don't have the time, as you said. I don't necessarily have the interest to go this deep on all stories, but quite a few times, quite a few stories. Um, I now that I've been doing this a while, I experience it like a veil dropping in front of my eyes. It's very pleasant. At first, it spooked me out, and now I find it very pleasant to say, okay, I've reported a lot. I've read my notes. I don't have any idea how to write this thing. But on that, after that last read of the notes, I sit there, wherever that is, and feel the vibe, feel the accumulated vibe of the people that I talked to and the place. Where that first lead took me 3 weeks and a lot of huffing to figure out, now it's sometimes it's 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it's a day, but often it's less than 2 hours where the words just start to arrive, and uh, I am technically writing them down, but it's not thought that's generating them.
Right. So you don't think about writing while you're reporting.
No. If it's a breaking news story, obviously I'm going to come in with yes and no. At, I do obviously think like a reporter now, where there are points, questions that I need answers to before I can start writing. Um, I've been in breaking news situations on big breaking news stories at press conferences where other reporters are better in that situation, ask better questions. I've learned to just sit down and let the professionals handle that. Uh, but I can hold my own. But once I get the basics out of the way, a lot of it is just kind of, I'm sure you've experienced this, just the open-ended, then what happened? How'd you feel about that? And letting that kind of open-endedness translate into the writing has been the way that I work. Like, Susan Orlean has famously uses no structure. She doesn't sit down and create an outline. And I find that I have to write word to word and sentence to sentence.
Yeah. I want to get back to this point, Chris, because something happened in your Astrid Lopez story that revealed to me your level of discipline. But let me first put that subject on the table.
Okay.
So in the introduction, I talked a little bit about the features, so the listener has some idea. Um, but can you give us a sense how a story like that comes together from assignment to every stage, if you don't mind?
Sure. I'll do it briefly on this story because this story was not typical. Usually I spend some portion of every day looking for stories. And there's a whole process that goes along with that. This was not that. This somebody in the newsroom, I don't actually remember who, had already set up this basically a one-on-one press meeting, press conference, but for only one journalist, where a person from the New York Times would meet Astrid Lopez, the star of the story, who narrowly survived this awful plane crash in 1990 on Long Island, and this psychiatrist named Dr. Victor Fornari, who treated her for years after the accident. Walking into this at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, that's all I knew, was that these two people were going to be there and we're going to talk. Also there happened to be Astrid's sister and another longtime caregiver. And I guess I'm wondering how much to go into that. But basically this one landed in my lap and I just said yes.
So did you begin, I don't even know if they use the word anymore. Did you go to the morgue and pull up the old stories from 1990?
That would have been a smart thing to do. I recommend others do that because we actually had written 2 stories about Astrid.
I thought the 1990. I read the 1990 stories today,
yes.
And they're terrific. They really are terrific.
Yeah, and she looks like a different person then.
Yeah.
Then into the accident.
Well, even without the photographs, you convey just what she's been through. So finally, I mean, we can feel it.
Thanks. Yeah, really. And it's you can edit this out. I don't want to go on and on, but this was an awkward, strange story to begin with because it was generated by a PR person for the hospital pitching Victor Fornari's work as a child psychiatrist. So and he has a good story to tell. He worked with 21 child victims of the crash and used art therapy and other modalities to help them. So that's good. It was awkward because as they are boasting a bit about their experience in this case, Astrid Lopez is sitting there in obvious pain in her wheelchair and not doing well. And the dynamics between Astrid and her sister really began to rise up in that first interview. And I realized that, right as the 2 sisters basically had an argument in front of me, and I realized, oh, this is a much better story.
Yeah. And I mean, this holds true for people who do long form journalism and people who do nonfiction books. I mean, the story is the story. You could go in and think you're going to find X, and suddenly you've got Y and Z in your hands.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came in, honestly, I thought 2 things are in conflict for me. One, if an editor asks me to do something, my answer is yes. And then so that's how I got into this situation. And then for the first half of this interview, I think, this is a dog. I don't want to be here because I don't want to write about this psychiatrist and his press person kind of gently beating their chests about the great job they did when this woman is sitting here in obvious pain. Right. And then the pain took center stage and the problem resolved itself.
Yeah. And reading the 1990 stories and then reading your stories, it was an interesting time traveling experience because you picked up, you answered all the questions I wanted to know when I was reading the 1990 piece, plus more. Now, was it you accompanied Astrid Lopez to the crash site? Was that your idea?
She was already going to do that with Dr. Fornari. And you probably know how you gently but forcefully say, I and a photographer really want to be there.
Yeah.
They had not thought they had thought that would be a private thing.
Yeah. So when let's just pick it up. You're at the cemetery. Are you letting the experience wash over you, or are you looking for details that readers would appreciate?
In this case, and in all cases like this, I realized that we're in the car with these two sisters who are holding hands and saying prayers in Spanish as they're driving to the crash site. And I know, by then I had read the stories in the New York Times and elsewhere about the crash, so I knew that where we were going was the field where she was declared dead. So had been declared dead. So I knew in a situation like that, my main job is to shut up and keep my eyes open, tape record everything, take notes of everything. And I don't know what would, I didn't know what would become of it. We started in the field. It's actually somebody's front yard where the morgue had been set up. And then we pushed the wheelchair up the hill to closer to where the plane physically crashed. And that entire time, I didn't know what she would say or what details would come out. It's just open the aperture as wide as I can get it and take down everything.
I want to mention something that Dr. Funari said to you. And as you mentioned, he had been pressed into service starting in 1990, helping young survivors of the crash. And you tell us about his work. And then you revealed what I consider to be an extraordinary piece of information. State Department officials told him that they had intelligence suggesting Manhattan faced the threat of a major terrorist attack and asked him to create a federal plan for treating affected children. That happened in January 2001, 8 months before the 9/11 attacks.
Mm-hmm.
How did you react to that revelation?
Between you, me, and the listeners, to say that I thought he was lying would be overstating it.
Okay.
But I was skeptical. I just thought, really, this you? I mean, he's an expert in his field, but that just sounded. My journalistic kind of sensors went off to say, really? And so I did some work confirming that with others who worked on that report. I didn't need to include it in the story; it would have distracted. But I wanted to make sure that we weren't being lied to, or at least that he's a professional. I actually don't think that he was lying, but if he was overstating something, but it did after some reporting check out.
You handled it really beautifully, though, Chris. I mean, it could have hijacked the piece.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is a little eye-popping. But, you had your eye on the prize the whole time, and you didn't let it steer you away from what you wanted to say. Could you walk us through the process of, okay, now you've written the piece, you've got a good draft. What happens next at the New York Times?
This story received a lot of editor attention before it was published. My draft was too long, and I knew it was too long. I have a relationship with my editor, Bill Ferguson, on the Metro desk where, I don't go crazy on word count, but I want to get the pieces in place. And if there's words to cut, that's fine. So I handed it in at 3,200 words, and a lot of that was setting up. Well, the lead was longer because I thought that I needed to explain why Astrid was in such pain. She has two injuries that are still remaining from the crash site, one of which is named in the story that she needed a replacement knee. Also, her abdomen was crushed by the seatbelt, so she needs surgery on that. So I had thought that why is she in pain 35 years later? I had a little bit more detail on that in the lead, and then I also had more foreshadowing to set up things that would appear later on. And then, the last thing I think that I had that didn't appear in the story was more about this difficult dynamic between the sisters, between Astrid Lopez and Liliana Donlin. Astrid wasn't just rebelling against her pain. She was rebelling against her sister and her caregivers who are always telling her what to do. Partly because she has traumatic brain injury, and partly because to stay healthy, she needs to do a lot of things that cause her a lot more pain. And she, by her own description, responds sometimes like an angry teenager who says, just no, I refuse. And I think what remains in the story after editing was, a taste of that. But in my draft, I put more information in there to back it up and to really show the reader, here are these two sisters in a pretty serious running argument in front of me.
Yeah. Do you like working with editors?
I do. Yeah, I've always liked being edited. Editors here at the Times are obviously very smart. Bill Ferguson really understands story structure. I mean, I think I'm good on structure, but he understands better than I do reader expectations. What does the reader need to know right now? And if a question goes unanswered, where are the off-ramps that somebody's going to say, I don't understand this, I'm leaving. So he really helps me.
Were you satisfied with the final result?
I was. I thought that there were some. I was okay with losing the level of detail on the relationship between the sisters. I thought that in losing that detail, we lost some softness. This is a hard-edged story. This is a woman who survived a plane crash admitting, describing her very serious injuries that continue and pain that continues 35 years later, and saying she doesn't always want to continue living. I wrote my draft was too long and it had some jags that maybe didn't fit, but it did have softness. And I think that what we published, I think it was good and I like it. And I would have liked to have brought in more softness because Astrid is a soft, kind, sweet, earnest Catholic woman. And part of the reason why she doesn't really contemplate suicide is because she's a deeply observant Catholic who prays all the time. And those moments of softness I just thought was a nice note to hit, and came off a little hard-edged, I thought.
Yeah. Chris, I have to tell you, I love that story. And the second that I read it, I thought this is an example of what great newspaper writing is. And as I alluded to earlier, we just don't hear enough of that. People have a lot of complaints about media, but we don't hear people talking about how great it can be.
I agree. Yeah, and I think that in my last job, I worked for the Record newspaper in New Jersey, which is owned by Gannett. I pitched them a column. They made me a columnist, and my column was really focused on stories like this that are smaller on purpose, because then you get access. And because the stakes are a little lower, you can play with the writing and keep alive these different genres of journalism that we have lost. The talk of the town is maybe the last remaining remnant of this world where journalists just kind of go out and see random stuff, write it down in their notebooks and bring it back and tell a tale. And even in that iteration, it depends a lot on celebrity. I think that if we can do more of that street work with people who aren't famous, the Jimmy Breslin model,
right?
I would love that.
Oh. Chris, listen, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule and joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you for doing this. It's really great, Jim.
Well, you take care, Chris.
Okay.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.